Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Nick here, and today I'm going to be doing a Linocut engraving, and so I thought I'd string you along with the process. Firstly here, what I'm going to do is my traditional just kind of shaving and sanding of my linoleum so I can get it really smooth. I want my surface to be about as smooth as possible, and so usually I just take a razor blade and just kind of scrape off all the peaks and the texture away from the block. And then next, I just take some India ink and I'm going to stain it black, because that's the best way to see what you're actually carving. Most of the lines you're going to be making with an engraving tool are going to be finer than what you can get with a pencil anyway, so it wouldn't be very beneficial to kind of plan the whole thing out first and then carve according to that. And so I just kind of transfer a general sketch onto the piece, spray it with some spray fixative, and we're off to the races. I first started using engraving tools on linoleum about a year ago, and along the way I've learned a few things. I'm going to do a little quick talk about the tools. My engraving tools are a bit modified from what they came stock. So you can see right here that my bevels are much more close to perpendicular than they were before. The original angle on this tool was very shallow. I'll talk more about why that's important in a little bit, but first, let's look at my two most used tools, the square Burin and the elliptical tint. And you can see how high the angles are. And let's compare this with how some of my other tools came stock and how shallow these angles are. So why does it matter? Well, when you're traditionally carving on linoleum and you're pushing your carving tool through it, the removed area has to get displaced somewhere. And so with a traditional carving tool like this V-gouge right here, it has a space in the middle for that linoleum to get displaced and pushed out of the way. And what you're trying to do with the engraving tool is you want the bottom point of your engraving tool to kind of catch into the linoleum, and those corners on the front faces are so sharp, I sharpened mine up to about 5,000 grit, that they're going to cut away the linoleum and it's just going to get cut out of the way. And you'll see that these lines from the engraving tools aren't that much different from what I can get with the 1mm file carving tool, but these lines are going to be much deeper, and so even though that they're about the same width, they're much less likely to get crushed or filled in when you're printing them. Now let's compare it with much more steep angle, and you'll see that once the tip gets in there, it plows the linoleum rather than kind of cuts it. And that's because the corners of the face are too far back that it cannot cut away the linoleum that the tip is displacing. And so you just end up with this plowed sort of line. And we're going to try another one of these stock shallower angles. This one's like a nice diamond lozenge. And you'll see that it does about the same thing as the other angle tint. And if you've never held engraving tools before, you kind of have to keep them in your palm and hold them about like as level with the surface as possible. The most absolute shallowest angle you can imagine. Think more that you're kind of scratching the surface than you are cutting the surface. It's going to be weird to get used to, but you'll get it. So let's start carving. And please bear with me. It's kind of hard to get the camera to focus on what I want it to focus when there's so many moving things up close. And as you can see, it's a pretty slow process. Each mark kind of has to be made with some consideration. If you make your marks a little too close together, they kind of tend to collide and clear out spaces, and your paths, if you're going over a mark you've already made, tends to follow the old path. It's kind of hard to course correct with engraving tools. So let's just go ahead and time lapse this. And so this print was for an exchange for the Linocut printmakers Facebook group that I'm a part of, and we're doing postcard exchanges, so everyone's going to make a small postcard sized print and we're going to mail them to each other. And so the theme for this year's exchange was fun, and I don't know about you all, but for me, the most fun thing I've been doing in quite a while was playing Zelda Tears of the Kingdom on the Nintendo Switch. And I don't know, I feel like a kid again, where I can just lay in bed, not worry about anything, and just play video games for, hours on hours. And so I wanted to kind of depict that moment of me laying in bed at night, just the dark room illuminated only by the Nintendo Switch. I'm a big fan of dark scenes illuminated by like a single light source. And so the way I'm approaching carving is I'm going to start first with what I know is going to be illuminated, and I'm going to start carving that out. And then slowly and slowly I'm just going to keep adding more and more, and I'm going to kind of go back and forth between what do I think is illuminated, what is fun mark making, and what is easy to read or what needs more clarity. And so for this pillow here, I'm going to start with kind of the top of the pillow, and I'm going to carve away that highlight, and then I decide is this enough information for the viewer to tell like that this is a pillow or a blanket, or do I need to carve more out? And so then I'll start keep carving a little bit more until it's a little bit more recognizable as, you know, a pillow. And then all this mark making here, it's really cool, but sometimes it kind of makes the image a little bit too noisy, and so sometimes I'll knock it back and I'll just kind of go back and forth between, you know, can people understand what this is versus what it should look like, or if it looks cool. It's just a lot of back and forth, and so it's a slow process where you just kind of slowly peel an image away out of the darkness. And so in this image of fun, I've got myself, and over in the shadows we have the astronaut just barely lit. And so this body of work that I'm working on right now, I'm using astronauts as a symbol for kind of perfection, the ideal kind of a sort of life that I might want, responsibility, stuff like that. You know, we often equate, you know, rocket science with being something really hard to learn, something that requires a lot of perfection, no mistakes, stuff like that. And so here it kind of works as a metaphor for me, my desires to be, you know, a really great artist, and a symbol for, you know, perfection, responsibilities, things that I need to be doing, the track that I want to be on. And so here we just kind of display kind of an inner struggle between having fun, laying in bed, feeling like a kid again, with the kind of adult responsibilities of the astronaut trying to pull me out of bed and just kind of bring me back into reality. A reality all too harsh. I do need to start making money again, and time to go back to work. You know, school season starting back up again. I can't just be making prints day in, day out again, every day of the summer like I want to be. That's what really would be fun. Now it's time to finish up this carving. I'm using my square Burin to kind of get these nice, clearing out the space, because a square Burin can clear out a lot more space than that elliptical tint. And I like that you can vary the line depending on how hard you push into the block. So you can get a nice variety of tapered lines. And so I didn't quite want the harsh cold white to light up the background of this scene, so we're going to do a sort of yellow to orangish color for the background, and that way it kind of gives off a more warm, fun, inviting atmosphere, the way I feel when I play video games at night. And so rather than doing a reduction block off of this block, I went ahead and cut a scrap piece of mat board to be the size of my block, and I'm just going to use this for a background flat. I like the way that mat board has a little bit of tooth, and it doesn't quite release all of the ink from the surface, and so it kind of gives you a little bit of a sort of kind of, you know, texture to your background flat. It's very soft feeling, and I like that. And this paper that I'm using is a cotton flurry from Boxcar Press, and it's a rather hard and stiff paper, and so printing this first layer kind of helps knock back some of that texture and smooth out the surface, making it a little bit easier to print my next layer onto it. And after that's had time to dry, this is where things get a little bit tricky. So because there's a lot of black in my image, I'm going to need a lot of pressure to get all that ink to transfer nice and smoothly. But with a lot of pressure also increases the chances of my lines getting smushed, or it to push ink into my fine little lines. And so I have to be very careful on how I ink up and how I print in order to make sure that my lines stay nice and crisp. The ink that I'm using already comes very stiff straight out of the can, so I didn't really add any mag carb to it. You want to have your ink about as stiff as you can, but still being allowed to roll out. If your ink is so stiff that it doesn't roll out very evenly, then I think it's a little bit too stiff. And so this is right on the border of being able to still roll it out. As far as sprayers go, I'm using my hardest sprayer. Softer sprayers have a tendency to kind of go into the lines and fill them in, and so with a hard sprayer, it's less likely to kind of squish and fill into those lines. And for starting ink, I have just a little bit less ink than I need on my slab, because I'm going to roll it up slowly. If I start off with too much ink, then that excess ink is definitely going to get pushed into my lines. As far as inking up the block goes, I'm using barely any pressure. It's just about the weight of my hand and the weight of the brayer onto the block. If I have too much pressure, then I'm going to force that ink into my fine lines. And so I'm trying to stay very surface level and just letting the ink stick to itself. And it's going to do a lot of really light passes rather than doing, you know, fewer heavier passes with more ink. Once I'm ready to print, I'm going to go ahead and set it up into my registration jig, which is a little L-shaped piece of masonite. That's the same thickness as my block, so about 1/8 of an inch, and 2 pieces of mat board for registration up on top, and that's just going to be where I slot my paper into. And so block into the bottom L, paper is going to sit into the top L, and if I do that the same way both times, then it should be in the same spot every time, in theory. For the first print, I used felt sprint printing because felts transfer a lot more ink, but this time I don't want the felts to kind of squish my ink through, and so I'm going to use here, I've got 4 pieces of newsprint to be my cushion to kind of help overcome any sort of unevenness in my linoleum block, and then I'm going to print with a very thin sheet of acrylic, and that's going to be able to kind of disperse the pressure evenly across the surface, but it's not so soft that it would push any of the ink or the newsprint or the paper down into my grooves. It all kind of, the pressure stays all at the very top surface level, and so that'll kind of help keep my lines crisper than if I was printing with felts. And finally, we have the finished print. And in the scan, it looks a little bit kind of staticky in the black areas, but in person, it really doesn't look like this at all. I think it's just a product of the high resolution scan. But from now on, the hardest part of the print will be to keep your lines from filling in. And I'd say I probably get about 3 or 4 prints of nice, crisp, clean image before my lines start to fill in. It'll fill in regardless. That's just the nature of how this works. The pressure is going to push a little bit of ink into your white areas little by little. And for me, when I'm printing, I usually add a little bit more ink to my slab every other print, and I don't add very much. I just kind of scoop off a little bit, and I just kind of add a few little taps of ink to the slab. Not much at all. Just trying to keep it consistent. I really don't want to fill it in. After about 3 or 4 prints, I can tell that my fine lines are getting a little bit filled in, or if I accidentally add a little bit too much ink. And so here I kind of have 2 examples of filled in prints, and one of the things I'm really looking for is kind of the white of my eyes, if they filled in or not. That's when it's time to clean the block. And so I'm just going to take a little bit of my cleaning solvent. In this case I'm using mineral spirits, but you could also use vegetable oil or mineral oil, and I'm just going to clean all of that ink out of my block. Thoroughly scrub all of the ink from inside the cracks and on the surface. And then once I've kind of scrubbed it, and so I don't really feel any resistance from the ink left on the block, it should feel smooth and slick when you're passing over it, I'm going to take another blue towel and just kind of wipe off all the excess solvent that's still on there. And once I've soaked up as much solvent as I can, making sure I get inside those cracks too, I'm going to take a little bit of talc powder. You can also use baby powder, and then I'm going to lightly brush it, and it's going to fill in all those cracks, absorb any of the excess solvent that might be in there, and it adds a little bit of a protection to help your lines not fill in for a few more prints. And then sweep the excess into the trash, and then I'm just going to go ahead and wipe again with the dry towel to get any of the excess talc off, and that's a clean block, ready for another round of printing. And it'll probably last me a good another 3 or 4. Sometimes I've had to go up to 8 prints not filled in. Depends on how careful you are. But yeah, that's my printing process for printing lino engravings. Maybe you learned something new, or if you just enjoyed my process, maybe you can leave me a like. Right now I'm probably in Wisconsin doing the really big prints, and so maybe the next video I'll have out for you all is the conclusion to how that went. And so maybe consider subscribing if you want to see how that turned out. Anyway, I'll see you later. Keep on printing.